Hello everyone, I hope you're doing good. So today we gonna discuss about the 12 factor app used in the microservices ecosystem. So let's get ahead. The first step in the 12 factor app is the build phase. The build phase is when we get the code base from our GitHub, for example, and then we couple it with the different dependencies that we have in our code base. So it's actually the build phase when we build our code, for example, using the Maven or Gradle uh, build generator or build tool, then we release. When we release the artifact, usually it's the release candidate artifact, we release it to our dev environment. For example, here, as you can see, we have like three dev environment that should be the same. So this is a very essential characteristic of the 12 factor app is that it's the environment should be the same. So the dev environment, the test environment, and the production environment should be cloned. So whenever the artifact, once it passes the build phase, it typically should have the same exact signature or the same exact content from the dev environment to the test environment until reaching the production environment. So the second step is the releasing the artifact. Okay. The third step is to actually run this artifact. Typically, when we try to run the artifact, we run it on a platform as a service product, for example, in Azure, in Amazon Web Services, or we can just use our local server, for example, like a JBoss server or Tomcat server, etc. So we actually run the microservice, and we typically do some recurrent stateful database backup, cloud backend service, and email backend service, etc., etc. So here, as you can see, we have, for example, a configuration file that uses the microservice, and then it just runs on your server. This is actually a very brief and very holistic view of the things. There's without doubt very different steps to that and to get your microservice to work, but here I'm just trying to pass through the steps without delving into the details. So here you can see there's a written layer, log storage service, log analysis service, etc. And all these are provided actually by the platform that you use. But mind you that the phase of running the microservice, it operates on the microservice to be run after that it released to the production environment. Okay. The remaining the remaining steps are actually, as you can see here, the code base that we saw here, the dependencies that we saw here, the configuration part in the running phase, the backend services which backs all the dependencies that we use in our platform. For example, if you are using a Microsoft Azure database or a RabbitMQ or Kafka queue manager, etc., etc. So you use your backend services, then you go throughout the build, release, run process, and then you keep all processes stateless and share nothing, store state, with the other persistent data in a stateful backend services. So this is actually the microservice or the artifact itself. It should be ephemeral. So it shouldn't be stateful. So it is like used once with the same artifact version. For example, if we are talking about 1.2.3 artifact version, it should be used from the build phase until running on production. There's also the port binding, so every port should be binded to a service that listens on that port, and we don't rely on runtime server injection. So we gotta consciously use our ports to with our microservices in order to avoid being sniffed on the network, etc., etc. There's also this concept of concurrency. So for the concurrency, we have to distinguish the process types. For example, if it's a web background worker, utility, etc. There's also the disposability. So the disposability makes a process start up quickly, up to 4 seconds, and shut down safely, or what is called in the DevOps jargon, what is called as blue-green deployment. So when there's a new artifact that enters to the production, the last artifact that was already running should be shut down and the new one should be running, and this transition should be seamless. So there is no outage between in that very moment when we switch from the previous artifact version to the new artifact version. There's also this concept of dev production parity. So, in order to maximize dev and production parity by maximizing or actually, sorry, minimizing the gaps in time between deploys to hours and personal authors and environments. So, what you should have in dev, you should have it in the production environment. There's also this concept of logs, or what is called logs aggregation. So all the logs that are in our microservices should be aggregated and centralized to a single unit in our server. So that makes it more easily to debug and to trace the transactions, for example, or any use case from point A to point B. There's also the last thing is the admin processes. The admin processes is when we run on of admin processes, for example, DB migration, RPR, one-time scripts in the same environment as normal processes. So it's like when we get to introduce the microservices, we make sure that there's one admin that can perform critical operation like DB migration, REPL, and one-time script. So here's a quick overview on the 12 factor app, and let me know in the comments if you have some questions or if I explained something that's not that clear. So I'd be happy to answer your questions. Thank you.